Hello and welcome to another episode of Slick Talk. I am your host, Blackstone Joe, and as you'll soon find out, I'm joined by a guest today. Some of our listeners might have met her recently if they stopped by our booth at Oshkosh, but for those that don't know Raegan, much like myself, she is another senior analyst with Blackstone Laboratories, and it's high time we did another Meet the Analyst segment on this podcast. So without further ado, let's start the show. Thank you so much for joining me, Raegan.
Hey, Joe. Thanks for having me today.
So I mentioned at the top of the show, in addition to being a senior analyst, that some of our listeners might have met you at Oshkosh, some of our listeners, and of course, some of our customers as well. So we're going to go back a bit further, but I wanted to start with Oshkosh anyway, just because there's so much that goes on, and some of our listeners know what Oshkosh is, some of them don't. But would you mind unpacking the Oshkosh experience? You know, because your perspective, you just went there for the first time. What's it like? What stuck out to you? Anything memorable?
Absolutely. So for anyone listening that might not know, Oshkosh is an aviation gathering and air show that happens every summer in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. So tons of people travel from all around the country and even the world to attend. During that week, Oshkosh becomes the busiest airport in the entire world. So it's just absolutely packed with pilots and their families, aviation enthusiasts. It's a really busy place during that week. So Blackstone attends Oshkosh every other year, and we have a booth there. And this year I was able to attend with some other analysts as well as our president, Ryan Stark. It was just an absolutely fantastic experience. It was my first time there. And we had a couple of weather mishaps. And by that, I mean some torrential downpour that soaked our tents. And I do mean camping tents because that's what you do at Oshkosh. You camp in the campground beside the air show area. So that's fun. But other than that, it was really wonderful. We got to meet a lot of different customers. So current customers that already are familiar with oil analysis, and they shared some wonderful stories about their experiences, possible problems that we detected. So got a lot of great information there. And then we also got to spread the word about oil analysis to pilots that weren't familiar.
And I think unlike myself, because I went to Oshkosh, my first time was, this might have been 2017. Yeah, that sounds right. But unlike me, though, you have a bit more, I guess, skin in the game as far as like Oshkosh means more to you. And I think that definitely has a lot to do with ground school. And now you're continuing your education doing flight training, right?
Yes. So I'm currently in flight training. I only have about 25 hours, which is pretty measly, probably compared to a lot of the aviation people that might be listening. But yes, I'm in flight training right now.
And that's exciting for a number of reasons because, I mean, obviously flying, but you get to connect with our aircraft customers in a way that so many other analysts might not be able to. And I think that's what's really cool. And when you were talking to people at the booth, were any of them surprised that, you are learning to fly yourself, or did any of them have any interesting insights, they wanted to share with you? What were some of the interactions you had at the booth that stuck out to you in some way, shape, or form?
Yeah, I think definitely surprise was some of the reaction. I think a lot of customers might think that at Blackstone, we're just in the lab. But I think that when they see we have a genuine interest in aviation and that our president has his pilot's license, several other people that work at Blackstone already have their pilot's license. So I think that's where some of that surprise comes from is, seeing that very genuine interest in aviation.
Yeah. And now I just want to backtrack a little bit because you haven't worked at Blackstone forever. You've had to have had other jobs. And I think to tell the listeners to give us a little more character, a little more background, I do like to ask people that come on these Meet the Analyst segments to talk a little bit about what they've done before. So would you be cool with telling us what the first job was way before Blackstone?
My first job ever? Oh gosh. It's some traumatic memories coming up. But my first job ever was actually at Dairy Queen as a teenager. I think that fast food service is something that everyone needs to do. It definitely builds a lot of important skills. But there were some times, that I was quite literally scrubbing the floors with customers sort of walking over me. So, Blackstone is definitely a much more comfortable environment, quite a step up from my first job that I had all the way back as a teenager.
Food service. Yeah, I have some trauma in that world too. And I think the nice thing now is that if you know how to handle folks who are a little upset, wondering about their results that you served them, wondering about, what went into that process. I mean, in some weird way, shape, or form, it relates to what we do now, because sometimes you have to manage expectations and explain how we got from point A to point B. We're just doing it with engine oil. So jumping off to engine oil, another area I like to approach is first car, because whether it was your choice or not, I think the first car you drive informs a lot of your character. And I've spent a lot of time on this show talking about the Pontiac Sunfire that I rolled up to my first interview with Blackstone in and all those days. But what about you? What was the first car that you were behind the wheel of?
So my first car was a Pontiac G6. I thought it was going to be a really great car for me. My sister had this two-door coupe red Mustang. And, I thought I'm going to get a reasonable, reliable car. I'm not going to go the flashy route. So I picked this very, unassuming looking Pontiac, but it ended up being a total lemon. And I replaced absolutely everything on that car down to the windshield wiper transmission, which, yes, that is a thing. So, it wasn't the best purchase on my part.
Did you get a sample of the used oil from that car?
No, unfortunately, I sold that years ago before I had ever heard of oil analysis, but I wish that I could track that car down and get a sample, because I'm sure that would be just illuminating.
I didn't get a sample from the Sunfire either. It tortures me to this day, but I'm impressed to hear about all of the maintenance that you did on that. Because you already had a fair amount of knowledge, a fair amount under your belt before even coming to Blackstone. So there had to be some things that you appreciated learning and some things that maybe weren't so important that you might ignore now that you're an analyst with Blackstone. So is there any maintenance tips or tricks that you grew up hearing around shops, dealerships that now you might think of a little differently?
I would say certainly the importance of sticking to the classic 2,000, 3,000 miles between oil change intervals is something that, you always hear that from family members at dealerships, shops. That's just very common knowledge that's floating around. But through working at Blackstone, I've really learned that that's not necessary for most vehicles. In most applications, you're able to go quite a bit longer between oil changes. So that's something that I definitely got working at Blackstone. I've been able to extend my oil change intervals quite a bit, and that saves me money in the end. So I'm happy.
Yeah, one of my favorite personal stories was after I don't know if you ever remember seeing it, but I had a Silverado for a while. And when I got it, one of the salespeople told me that, oh, by the way, this needs 0-20 synthetic. And since it's synthetic, you'll be able to run that about 7,000 miles, maybe more. And I thought that was great. I mean, it's fine, but I held back from challenging it. I just wanted to say, I was like, how do you know that? Have you measured the TBN? Can you tell me? But on a very real subject, though, something that also applies to past maintenance and maybe what you do now. Were you loyal to any particular brand or blend of oil? Was there something where, you ever were told, oh, always buy Mobil 1 or always buy AMSOIL? Did you have any allegiance to that you might have left behind now? Has any of that changed? What's your purchasing habits when it comes to getting oil?
So previously, I have stuck with high mileage blends. So that's before I worked at Blackstone. I've always had cars that had over 100,000 miles when I bought them. So I thought that it was necessary to buy a high mileage blend. And now I will stray away from that unless that's what's on sale. I really go with the cheapest conventional oil, as long as the viscosity is where it needs to be, then that's what I'll go with in my car. And I'll run that about 10,000 miles. And that seems to be working really well for me.
And now you've built up like a sample history, right? So it's not merely just, you were drinking the Kool-Aid. Like you've seen the results from going these extended intervals. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, I've definitely seen the data to back that up. So I feel confident in that decision. When I first got my car, I was only running about 5,000 miles and then used oil analysis to work up.
And when you've started to do extended oil use and seen these results, have you told anyone, maybe in your family or friends, that like, yeah, I was going from 5 and now I do 10,000. Do you get any weird reactions? Do you get people who say, what are you doing? You're going to ruin your engine. Or is it all just people accept that that's perfectly doable now?
I definitely get met with a lot of skepticism, or, maybe people will say something in passing, kind of like what you said, not thinking you're going to challenge it, like, oh, if the oil gets dark quickly, that's a bad thing. You'll hear that. And then if I counter that with, no, actually, that's not necessarily a bad thing. And you probably can still run it longer if everything else is doing okay. Definitely when you respond that way, you can get some odd looks and some skepticism. But I think really the proof is if someone sends in their oil and sees that, it compares well with averages, the physical properties are where they should be, then they become believers. So I've been able to have a few friends and family members send in samples, and now they're a little more willing to believe that they can run it longer.
Well, it's good that you are able to pass along positivity and find good results, but just as well as I do that part of our daily grind is having to send along some not so great news, but news that can help people fix a problem. We steer them towards, what might be going wrong and what to do about it. So I know that you brought with you a example of this sort of instance where you were able to point out data that caught a problem, and then we were able to get a little bit of feedback from the customer, right?
Yes.
All right. So what sample do we have in front of us here, Raegan?
So we're looking at a sample. It's an aircraft sample from an O-360 A1 F6, a Lycoming engine. So in this particular case, the first few samples had high metals. Several elements were highlighted, mostly metals from the cylinder area. So we're talking about aluminum, chrome, and iron here. And those metals were reading high for several samples. And then all of the sudden, metals dropped into the normal range. And when that happens, we obviously point that out and let the customer know that it looks like something changed for the better. And, we inquired about what they might have done to yield those improvements. In the comment, we said, we're not sure what you did, but it looks like it really helped. So we did get a follow-up email on this, and the customer let us know that prior to some repairs they had done, that CHTs or the cylinder head temperatures were running hot. And so that's what was going on during those first few samples. That excess heat could have been causing some excess cylinder area wear. So prior to the sample where those improvements happened, they replaced the baffling. And so that directs air over the cylinders in an air-cooled piston aircraft engine. So the cylinders were better cooled and they weren't having the issues with high CHTs anymore. And we saw a really nice drop in wear metals on our end to correspond with that. So that was one of those good cases where they were able to, detect the problem, but while it was still reversible, get metals where they should be, and things improved on their end too.
Yeah, it's still reversible. The nice thing too is, we're looking at high metals, but I wouldn't be surprised if, we take the first sample that they sent in, you had some excess wear, but I wouldn't be surprised if that, we're not talking about metal that necessarily would show up in a filter plate. Like, you would really need to consider taking a used oil sample and running it through a spectrometer to see if these metals are indeed high, because that's something where, just to digress a little bit, how often do we find coolant leaks where people are not even noticing an unusual color or anything that's noticeably amiss on their end, but we're able to catch it at the microscopic level. And that definitely, it looks like the case here with this one, because things were definitely going in a bad direction. And that's the purpose of used oil analysis, but it's not so much metal where I would assume you'd be seeing a lot in the filter. I mean, I don't know what you think, because we both looked at a few aircraft filters by now, but what would you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that metals are really just at the point where, we'd start to mark them, start to talk about them. So at that point, they definitely might not be seeing visible metal in the oil filter. They did have the high CHTs, but without those microscopic metals, they, may have not gone forward with those repairs.
Yeah, and the nice thing too, I mean, not only so we detected the high wear, but we can rule some things out even without knowing, where temps were at. We know that this had nothing to do with contamination. We know that, the oil looks like it's holding up well, a normal viscosity in every sample. Even if someone's looking into used oil analysis as a way to solve a problem, and they're wondering, well, are you able to definitively find out that was an issue with the baffling? We can steer you in that direction, but at the very least, off top, we're going to be able to rule out a number of possible explanations.
Right.
All right, well, this has been a lot of fun chatting it up with you, Raegan. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me. I look forward to if we find other interesting problem reports, anything else we can unpack. And obviously, we might get some interaction from listeners who either met you at Oshkosh or they're curious what else you're up to while you're in flight school. But that's for another episode, another time. Thank you so much, though, for joining me.
It was fun. Thank you for having me.
And that brings our episode to a close. Thanks again to Raegan for taking the time to join me on this episode of Slick Talk. If you have any questions for either myself or Raegan, don't hesitate to send them our way on social media. The usual channels, Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. And before you leave, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. This is Blackstone Joe signing off.